right. Welcome everyone to the I2SL Labs2Zero Energy Score webinar. Today's webinar is being recorded. The recording will be available on I2SL's website, www.i2sl.org by the end of the week. All attendees have been muted to minimize background noise. And if you have a question during the presentation or any technical difficulties, please type it in the Q&A box. Okay, I will hand it over to you, Gordon.
Thanks. Yeah. And so today we're going to talk about the Labs2Zero program, specifically talking about the energy score and also the new pilot energy score and also the LBT, some of the changes there that we've made. We have three speakers. Myself, again, I'm president of I2SL. Alison Farmer will also be speaking. She's the program manager for the Labs2Zero program, as well as the secretary of the I2SL board. And then we also have Josh Kace, who's the technology researcher and also head of the Buildings Performance Database for the Lawrence Berkeley National Labs, or in government technical speak, that's the BPD of LBNL. So those are the three speakers we have today. We're going to, again, I'll go through a quick overview of the Labs2Zero program. Then Alison will get into the LBT and also the new pilot energy score, talk about that. Josh will give a little more of a deeper dive into some of the development of the energy score, how we did that, or how he was behind that. Again, Josh, also just a little more background. He's also that group that he's the head of also was involved with the technical development of the score in terms of the linear regression analysis and other technical aspects of it. So that's he'll be speaking to that and some of the work that he did, that his group did on that. Then lastly, we'll do a walkthrough through the LBT, sort of a little bit of how to enter data into it so you can get an idea. It's quite simple, but we wanted to go through it so everyone has a good understanding of that and a little bit of look forward to 2024 in terms of some other goals we have for the program. Then we'll get into a little Q&A at the end. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat and we'll pick them up at the end of the session. So again, to give you a quick overview on this, again, obviously 2023 was quite a year for climate change. Things were, very significant. Things are getting sort of worse, obviously. And one of the things that just sort of caught me last year that really stood out was the Canadian fires. Obviously there was discussion in the news from time to time, but if you look at the whole year, the fires ended up burning about 71,000 square miles, which is equivalent to the size of the state of Washington. Literally, that's about 5% of Canada's forest area. If you look on the right, you can see the little graph there that, the fires and burned area was significantly more, literally 6 times the average, so far above anything that had happened in the past. And I think, obviously floods, literally in the news the last couple of days, it's been the floods out in Los Angeles, obviously severe weather-related incidents and the heat from last summer. So if you look on the graph also on the lower right, again, last year was just so significant in terms of the increase in temperature. It wasn't just a gradual increase in the previous year. You can see it was literally a step jump for July and August. It was the 2 worst months on record, so very significant. And I saw this quote, which I thought was pretty significant, that knowing that we will look back on today's extreme events as mild relative to what lies ahead in the future is truly mind-boggling. So obviously we need to do something about this to be able to prevent climate change from getting significantly worse. So what can we do and why are we here? Well, labs are obviously an important part of this equation. That lab emissions, sort of, again, my rough estimate is around 40 million metric tons per year just for the US. Globally, it's probably at least 3 times that, so a significant number. If you look at it in terms of other buildings, labs are about 5% of US commercial building emissions. Again, significant amount of energy and cost. And part of the issue is a lot of people look at labs and say, well, labs are just too complicated, we'll work on other things, that's more important. Well, the problem is if we don't work on labs, and in 2030, if the estimates are what we need to do to cut building emissions in half and we don't work on labs will now just be 5%, they'll be 10%. So the number's getting bigger, will get bigger percentage-wise, and we have to take action on these facilities. So we created this program we call Labs2Zero. Basically, we have 6 different elements of the program. We'll be covering that. I'll cover that quickly, and then Alison will get into detail on 2 of them. But again, you see that we have the lab benchmarking tool, sort of the basis of the program. It's the foundation. It's where all the data will come in to be analyzed. Our sort of entry point for people. And again, we already have that. It already exists. The next piece of this is the scoring of performance, both in terms of energy and emissions. We'll talk about that a little bit more. We'll eventually be certifying the program, probably maybe next year in 2025. We'll roll out a certification program for Labs2Zero for the scoring. Well, then this year we're working on these, what we call the AIM report and Design2Zero reports. These are reports we'll talk about that get into what you can do to reduce your emissions and energy use. And lastly, we'll have accreditation and training for the program as well. So that's sort of the program in a nutshell. We now look at the different pieces of it. The LBT, which again, I'll pass this over to Alison, who'll get into more detail on this. But the bottom line is this is a benchmarking of energy use as well as other parameters as well. This was jointly developed by Lawrence Berkeley National Labs, by the Josh's group, the Building Performance Database, in conjunction with ourselves, I2SL. A couple of years ago, we fully internationalized this, so this can be used everywhere around the globe, and we have over 1,000 peer labs, so it's the largest lab energy performance database in the world. And again, we'll get into more detail on that later. So the other aspect of this now is scoring. This is something we haven't had in the past. We've done manual benchmarking, but now we can actually get a score similar to the Energy Star score, the EPA's Energy Star score, same sort of concept. And again, we'll talk about this more in detail as well. But we've now, that's been out and released. We'll talk about it, sort of a 1 to 100 type score based on your building's performance in terms of energy. We also are working on other scores. So really what we're developing is a scorecard. So there'll be multiple scores in these areas of both energy, operational emissions, and embodied carbon. We're currently doing a data request for embodied carbon data for buildings. So if you've done that type of work on a new facility or other types of laboratories, we'd love to get that data to begin to populate this. Our goal is to have a embodied carbon benchmarking similar to the energy benchmarking sometime around April of this year. So we'll release that with the idea that we'll then develop a score later in the fall, sort of a pilot score like we have for energy, but also for embodied carbon. And again, we'll also have a score for operational emissions, which we're currently working on, again, hoping to develop that for this spring. Again, we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. The other thing I wanted to mention is another very important part of the program is these reports, the AIM report, which relates to actionable insights and measures. That's for existing buildings. We have a similar report for new buildings, new building designs. We call the Design2Zero report. This will be sort of an automated report, basically sort of a first level, level 1 type audit. Literally, you'll put your data in for the lab benchmarking tool and then push a button, and basically out will pop a report indicating the different measures that you can use, what will be the impact of those measures on your building in terms of energy savings and cost savings, as well as what would be the sort of rough estimated cost of installing these type of measures. So you get sort of a return on investment for that, as well as we'll indicate relevant case studies. We'll have a database of case studies and provide sort of a curated list of case studies that would relate to the measures that are recommended for your building, and it would be measures that are case studies that are similar to your building as well. So that we're hoping to come out with, as I said, a little later this year, at least in terms of a very early version of it. This will be something we'll charge for. The scoring is all free. The energy scores and other aspects are free, free to use. The reports will be a cost, but again, very minimal in terms of a few $100s for typically something like this would be many thousands of dollars, even $5,000 to $10,000 for this type of engineering report. Again, level 1, but still, I think will be quite helpful and again, relatively inexpensive. So in terms of that AIM report, last year we developed basically cataloged quite a few measures that are potentially for both energy reduction and carbon emission reductions. Our goal for 2024 is now to pull that together, prioritize. We obviously can't cover all those in the initial report, but we do want to come out with a first sort of pilot level report, revision 1, sometime early this fall. Our goal here is to focus for this first report just on energy measures. So we'll cover more emissions measures, but just to get something out quickly, we wanted to narrow the scope. So we're going to focus on existing buildings and energy measures for those buildings, and we'll have some set of that. And then obviously as time goes on, we'll expand that set of measures, add emissions, add new buildings and other aspects to the report. But we want to get something out this year that people can start to work on, and we can get some feedback and do more of an iterative process on that. So that's the goal for the AIM report project. So again, in addition to having these scores, we want to be able to certify these scores as well. So that's a program we'll do, sort of a certification program, probably similar to the Energy Star certification. So it's not a heavy lift. It's more validating that the scores are correct, that the building's running, properly, not running out of spec, or, people haven't shut off their outdoor air intakes, that type of thing, to reduce energy, that the building is running in a normal aspect. Again, but not a heavy duty, should not be a very expensive certification, but one that really is there to validate that the scores are correct. And then with that, we can then recognize high performing scores. We'll also have a training and accreditation program. So basically to teach people how to use the program, also how to reduce emissions and energy use in buildings. So we'll have that and basically provide an accreditation on that as well. So again, if you look at the organization that we've created to do this, obviously it's a very aggressive program. We have quite a bit of stuff we're trying to accomplish in this program. Again, all about how do we accelerate this decarbonization of the world's laboratories. And to do that now, we have literally over 100 volunteers involved in the program. We have broken the effort into 5 different technical advisory councils, or TACs as we call them. We have one focused on the energy score, another one focused on the operational emissions score, another one focused on the embodied carbon scoring. We have a group that's working on the lab benchmarking tool, the LBT, focusing on enhancements and, again, helping with that user experience of that tool. And again, a lot of the entry for all this is coming through the lab benchmarking tool, so it's a very important part of the program, and we have a group focused on that. And then finally, we have a group that's focused on this reporting, the AIM report and the Design2Zero report. We call that the Assessment and Design Tools TAC. And that group is now broken into 4 groups. One is focused on creating a baseline model for the laboratory. So sometimes people don't put in all the information. They just put in maybe some strict requirements, and then we need to sort of make assumptions about the rest. Later, people can go back and put more data in to get a more accurate estimation of the building. But initially, we need to create a sort of a base model of that laboratory. We then have a group focused on sort of the different measures that could be involved, as well as what the impact of those will be, sort of an analysis engine. We have a group focused on the installed costs, helping us understand what the measures will cost to put in place. And finally, a group that's focusing on the case studies, pulling the case studies together, and then doing some maybe editorial work or selection work. So we still are adding more content experts. So if this is something you're interested in, like to participate, we'd love to get you involved. We're still accepting applications for these different TACs, some more so than others. But again, feel free to get in touch with us. We'd love to see if we can get you involved in the program. And again, later in future years, we'll also be adding an accreditation TAC and certification, again, to focus on those aspects. But again, that's more of a 2025 or late 2024 activity. So finally, we wanted to thank our sponsors. Again, this is a large program. There's a lot involved in making this happen. And we definitely wanted to thank our sponsors for this program, founding sponsors. And we'll also be adding some annual sponsors this year as well. But those are, you can see that both the diamond sponsors, platinum, and we have an international partner, which is SL Can up in Canada, that's helping us in terms of a rollout in the Canadian market. We also have, you see, gold sponsors, and finally some silver sponsors. So again, we appreciate all their efforts to help support the program and make this happen. Again, if you're interested in your organization is interested in becoming a sponsor as well, again, would love to get you involved in that also. So again, feel free to get in touch with us about that. Finally, we have a partner recognition program. So those people that are entering data into the lab benchmarking tool to develop and see their scores, or to do benchmarking of embodied carbon, would love to recognize you. So we have this program we call the partner program. So we have owner partners, which are owners that are putting their data into the LBT annually. So basically, if you're doing that, we'd love to recognize you and for that. We also have consulting partners that are putting data in on behalf of their clients. Again, we'd like to recognize you for that as well. We understand that this takes a little bit of time, not a lot of time, but obviously we want to appreciate your efforts in that regard. And finally, we have promotional partners, which are organizations that are promoting and encouraging the use of this program. So I would like to recognize them as well. So again, if you're willing to agreeing to enter some data into the program, again, we'd be happy to recognize you as a partner. So with that, I'd like to move over to Alison, who's going to get into the LBT and talk a little bit more about that program as well as the energy score. So Alison, why don't you take it away?
All right. Thank you, Gordon. I think you're all looking at the right screen there. So, okay, so Gordon talks a lot about the overall Labs2Zero program. I'm going to focus in this segment on the parts of the program that are already available for you to use today. So those are two main parts. The first one is the laboratory benchmarking tool, the LBT, which has for a very long time been really the only meaningful way to compare lab building energy performance to benchmark lab buildings. The other part is the new Labs2Zero energy score, which is probably an even better way to do that. But first, we're going to start with the LBT. So the LBT, if you haven't met it before, is a benchmarking analytics tool that's built on top of a database of more than 1,000 lab buildings. You benchmark your lab buildings by filtering that data set of 1,000 buildings. So you take the data set, you use filters on the tool, slice and dice it to select lab buildings that are like yours in terms of functional requirements. That's important because lab buildings have very, very varied functional requirements, and it's important to compare like with like. So you do that, you get your own peer group, and then you compare with that peer group things like your EUI, energy use intensity, or other metrics, whatever works for you. We have quite a lot of them in the tool. The LBT is completely free to use. It always has been. You can access it at this URL. We would definitely encourage you to take a look. We're going to get into lots more about it. One example of how you might use the LBT to do some benchmarking would be the following. So say you have in France, in Nice, beautiful Nice in climate zone 3A in the south of France, say you have a biochemistry pharma R&D building. The building's got about 40% lab space by area, and you want to know how it compares to its peers in terms of energy use intensity. So what you would do is you would go use the filters to select similar buildings. So you select biology, chemistry, biochemistry buildings with similar percentage lab space in the building by area. You would choose perhaps buildings in the same climate zone, and then you would chart the peer group that you obtain. In this case, you obtain a peer group of about 47 buildings by doing this process, which is enough. Typically, this is a little bit of an iterative process, so it takes a bit of engineering judgment to slice and dice the database in the right way to end up with a good peer group that's big enough to be statistically significant, but not so big that you're not selecting buildings that are truly like yours. In this case, what you see from the outputs is that your building is only seventh out of 48 buildings in the peer group for energy use intensity. So it's a pretty efficient building. That climate zone 3A is relatively well represented in the peer group. You can see it here, this bar. The peer group's got most buildings from climate zone 5A, which is where both Boston and Chicago are located. So that's why there are a lot of labs in those places. And we've got more than 300 peer group buildings from that climate zone. Most climate zones have some representation in the lab benchmarking tool database, but there are some places where it's a little bit lacking, especially really cold climates where we don't have quite as many buildings. If we continue to explore the database, we'll see that without looking at these pie charts in detail, we see that there are lots of different lab types, lots of different organization types who've contributed to the database. The largest groups are higher education, although we also have a lot of federal labs and a growing number of commercial labs as well. R&D is this big green slice in the chart in the middle here, although we do also have teaching and manufacturing laboratories as well. And then The biggest slices here in this pie chart on the right are for biology, chemistry, and biochemistry facilities, though that big red slice is physics and engineering. So we have a decent population from there as well. So a pretty good cross-section with some areas that are better represented than others. So you might ask where all this data comes from. Well, the data comes from users of the tool, like you, perhaps. So over time, users enter their data into the tool, enter their buildings into the tool to benchmark their buildings. Then on a periodic basis, staff at LBNL in Josh's group go through and do some light QC of the data that's been entered, and buildings that look real with good data get promoted into that peer group database. And at the same time, they get anonymized so that then at that point, other users of the tool can select those buildings from the database while they remain completely anonymous. So that's where the data comes from. We're up now, as we've mentioned a couple times, at more than 1,000 buildings. Most of the buildings in the database are from the US because historically that's really all we were accepting. But since we internationalized the tool in 2022, we started to get a few buildings in the peer group that are not from the US, and we expect that that number is going to keep growing over time, just as more people from non-US locations start using the tool. So if you want to get started using the LBT, we've got some resources for you. It can look a little daunting at first because you can enter more than 100 data fields per building, but you certainly don't need to get started. You only need to enter something like a dozen fields. And if you have those numbers at your fingertips and those values at your fingertips, it's only maybe a 15-minute process to get your data entered, to benchmark, and to get your energy score, even starting from 0 in the tool. We've got a new quick start guide that's linked from this slide presentation and also from the LBT website. It's just 2 pages. We'll tell you how to get an energy score quickly. We've got an older guide that explains how to do that iterative benchmarking process that I was talking about a little bit earlier. And also later in this webinar, after Josh speaks, I'm going to come back and give you a walkthrough of how to enter data for one example building in the LBT. And you'll see that it's really pretty simple. In the meantime, we're going to get on to talking about the energy score. So as Gordon mentioned, the Labs2Zero program is going to include a scorecard. So multiple scores for different aspects of a building's performance, looking at energy and emissions. The part of that we have released now is the energy score. And sort of quick summary is that we are now displaying energy scores, pilot energy scores for all buildings in the lab benchmarking tool. So that means your buildings, it means all of the anonymous peer group buildings. So you can now see energy scores for all of the buildings. It's all over the LBT. The energy scores are a percentile score from rating from 1 to 100, where 100 is best and 1 is worst. If you want to see your building scores in the LBT, you just have to log in, go to the Your Buildings tab, and the scores are shown for each building right in the main summary table for the most recent year. If you want to get more details, you can click on this building details button, the green button there, which will give you summary information about the score, about your building, and will also let you benchmark your building's performance over time. So this is something else that we just added to the lab benchmarking tool, the ability to look at longitudinal benchmarking, as we call it, for any given building. So you can look at energy score over time, site UI, or any of the other quantities that we allow you to plot. It's worth noting that the energy score is the only one that contains a weather correction there. So it's actually a really good way at looking at your building's performance over time. So we'll get back to looking at an example of a building later, but for right now, I'm going to turn it to Josh to talk about where the energy score came from.
Great, thanks, Alison. And thanks everyone for joining and having me here today. Let me just go ahead and steal the screen share. All right, so hoping to keep this relatively brief, but do want to get a little bit into the technical detail of how we went about developing the laboratory energy score. As a starting point, we wanted to just quickly run through the objectives when you're developing a score similar to the lab energy score and sort of the tenets that we followed in the process. I think our goal was to develop something that was as comprehensive and holistic to different lab requirements as it could be. We wanted a score that was transparent, that was well weighted in terms of the different factors going into the model, which outputs the score, and also keep things as simple as possible. It's easy to overcomplicate things with different parameters. So wherever possible, we wanted to make sure things were streamlined, straightforward, and easy to understand. And the goal of the score overall is, as many are aware, is to have something that is a little bit more both objective and easy to understand, intuitive to a user when it comes to the energy performance of their facility. And the goal there would obviously be to encourage improved performance. There is a lot of good data and information out there, research that's been done around simply having a score, and reporting that score can drive energy efficiency, beyond the existing ecosystem from that standpoint. So this was sort of how we went about scoping the process overall. And just to dive a little bit into how scores like this work. So they're not overly complicated processes in terms of steps, pretty easy to understand. You input information about your building, characteristics about your building. Primarily functional requirements are going to be a big aspect of that, and I'll get a little bit into that later in terms of how to define a functional requirement. We put all of those input parameters into the model, which was the bulk of the analytical work that we did on the development of this score. That model then outputs an expected amount of energy use for that building. So I'll get into how we leveraged LBT for this, but the general idea was the model is predicting the energy use of your building purely based off of the input characteristics of the building. You then take that predicted number and you compare it to the actual energy consumption of your asset, and then put that on a percentile basis to essentially convert it into a 0 to 100 score. So the general idea here being you are normalizing for as much as you can accurately claim, to develop as accurate of a predicted score to thereby compare to your actual energy consumption. So not an overly complicated process, but I will say that the regression model image within here does belie a decent amount of effort that needed to go into the development of the model itself. To get a little bit into those weeds, this was, obviously without going through the specific fields here, this is just a sampling of the different fields and characteristics that we leveraged across LBT when doing the initial data exploration, and essentially helping to determine which fields are most material to actual energy consumption of individual assets. And so we did look at a lot of different fields across a lot of different parameters, building features, types, lab areas. Obviously, location plays a factor as well with regards to climate. And engagement policy features, not something that we ended up including, and I'll get into some of the specifics as to why in the subsequent slides. One of the big questions, and definitely also wanted to give a shout out here to our technical advisory committees that Gordon had mentioned that I2SL has been overseeing. The energy score TAC was obviously fundamental to our development of this score, and helped us grapple with a couple of the big and important questions that come up when you're developing a score like this. The first of those really being the governing metric. So obviously you're comparing your energy consumption to your peers through a scoring process. How are you quantifying that energy consumption? For those who are not familiar with EUI, that's energy use intensity. So apologies for use of an acronym there, but essentially the energy use of a building per square foot. There's two main ways of looking at EUI. Site EUI is actual energy consumed at an asset, and source EUI goes a little bit further and looks at the upstream energy generation that goes into the energy consumption of your asset. So this was a big fundamental decision point for us when it came to the development of the score, whether to use site EUI or source EUI. We did move in the direction of using source EUI without getting too much into the specifics of this due to limited time. Source EUI aligns with the way that Energy Star goes about their 0 to 100 scoring across different property types. It's more complete from an energy accounting perspective in terms of the way that electricity and district systems are handled and quantified within the metric. And although site UI is more intuitive, source UI, we felt delivered better energy accounting to holistic energy performance of a building. So that was one of the major decision points we worked with the TAC on. The other, a little bit more in the weeds of the model. There are certain aspects of a building that you want to normalize for, meaning that they're core functional requirements of the asset that define and are material to the energy consumption of that asset. There are also a lot of things that we track within the LBT that are related to the measures you would take to make your asset more efficient. So just an example of this, obviously, through the use of an intensity metric, something like floor area is already being normalized for. A bigger building is going to consume more energy. A building with more occupied hours is going to consume more energy. There's nothing an energy manager at a building can do to reduce the occupied hours to try to save energy. The goal would be to meet those functional requirements with the most efficient energy systems possible. And so we used this and worked with the tax on understanding where functional requirements were, where there was some gray area in terms of maybe a functional requirement, maybe not, but also those things that are really just best practices from an energy management perspective and or system design attributes that govern how well that building performs overall. Diving quickly into the data availability question. So as I get into the actual parameters that made it into the model itself that were material to the regression, you'll notice that there are a lot of things that are tracked within LBT that are not part of the current score formula. And the reason for that is a lot tied to data availability. So in a lot of cases, if we don't have good data coverage across a particular attribute, we're not going to be able to build a good regression off of it. So this is really to message the general idea. And as Alison and Gordon mentioned before, one of the best ways that we can improve this score over time is gathering more and more data. So the more that we can do to drive more comprehensive data across buildings, in addition to more buildings within the database overall, the more fine-tuned we're going to be able to get with bringing more granular building features into the model. Overall, the model parameters that ended up in the final version of the model are listed here. So cooling degree days, occupied hours, lab area ratio, lab type and lab use type were also key, and I'll get into the specifics of how those ended up modeling the score overall. But as noted before, it's only a few parameters that are being thrown into the model to help define the score, but we hope to get more granular with this over time. And this does align also with the way Energy Star goes about their scoring. Despite looking at lots of different fields, there are typically 5 to 10 that end up defining the actual energy score. Here's a good example of how that energy score gets built up from a predicted EUI standpoint. So this is an example building here, 47,000 square feet. The general idea of this visual is to show you how the predicted EUI is built up from those regression parameters. So in this case, this sample building was not a manufacturing laboratory. It was not a teaching laboratory. And therefore, those two parameters had no impact on the score overall. But occupied hours obviously do impact the score, lab area ratio, and the fact that this was a biology/chemistry facility. You could also see cooling degree days are relatively minimal within this climate, and so didn't have a huge impact on the predicted EUI. But this is a built-up score that ends up getting compared to the actual score or the actual consumption of a building to determine the 0 to 100 score. Alison will get more into our pilot overall, but we did want to give an example of building that we piloted initially that we also had a lot of information on in terms of energy audits recently completed at the building, and just modeling through what impact those ECMs would have on the score overall. This happened to be a building that initially scored as a 40, and after implementation of these ECMs, the score theoretically jumped from 40 up to 67, which at least in the guts of the various engineers that we had involved with the initial process here, felt like a reasonable increase in score associated with implementation of ECMs from an energy audit. So with that, I will hand it back to Alison, and looking forward to fielding questions later.
All right, thanks, Josh. Let's just grab the screen back. Okay, so yes, as Josh mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit about our pilot phase right now, and this is also where we make requests of you. So we piloted the score before we launched it with a decent number of organizations. So we looked at all of their building scores in detail with them. We got feedback. We talked about what might be missing, how they felt about the scores. And that was a really helpful way for us to figure out how best to launch the score and what sort of messaging to put out around it. We also did some database-wide checks looking for any biases in the scores and anything else that we ought to correct before we launched. We launched the score, we then entered our post-launch pilot phase. We launched the score in October 2023 at the I2SL annual conference. The pilot phase is going to run at least through mid-2024. And at the end of that pilot phase, we're going to gather all the data that we've collected during that phase, all the feedback, and we're going to reanalyze the score and put out a Rev 1 version of the score, and it will no longer be a pilot score. Right now in this pilot phase, we are seeking feedback from users like you. Now is the best time to provide feedback to have an impact on the score, on the scoring methodology. So how you do that, 3 simple steps here. You enter your building's data or a building's data via the LBT. You check out your scores, and then you let us know what you think. So send us feedback at this email address shown here for the lab benchmarking tool, or honestly, you can email any one of us on this panel as well. So we know that there are some places that the score still needs more data, still needs more work. We are aware of that. You'll see that if you enter data for any of those building types in the LBT and get a little warning triangle show up, you'll then be able to click through and view what the warning is about on the building details page. So there are certain types of lab facilities where we don't feel like we have enough data to have an accurate score yet. We also give you a warning if the data year was 2020, because for reasons that nobody wants to talk about at this point, because we've talked about them way too much, people get weird scores for that year because there were weird things going on in buildings. But specifically, there are certain types of facilities that we are looking for more data on. One of those is vivarium facilities. We don't do a great job of scoring vivarium dominated lab facilities right now. So we're really looking to collect some more data from those types of facilities so we can improve that. Manufacturing facilities, so that's the sort of, pharma manufacturing laboratories, we are looking for more data on as well, so we can improve the scoring for those types. Crime labs is another area where we've got some data, but not a whole lot. And then I mentioned before, we're lacking in the database in labs that are in very cold climates. So climate zone 6 and above, we'd love to get more data there as well. So we definitely would love it if you could all submit data on those types of buildings. But even if you have other types of buildings that are well covered by the score right now, we'd love to get your feedback on what you think of the scores for your buildings once you see them, and what you think of the process of getting the scores and so on. So very much welcome any and all feedback in this pilot phase. So for the last part of this webinar, we're going to go through a specific example of getting an energy score for a lab building. That's just to demonstrate that it's not a terribly complicated process, and that the data you need to enter is actually not a huge lift for most people who are involved with buildings to provide. So our example building is going to be a fictional chemistry and biology teaching lab building that is located on a university campus that's in Santa Fe, New Mexico. It's a fairly large building, 125,000 square feet gross area. The building, as is normal, contains some other stuff as well as labs. It's got offices and auditoriums, some other types of spaces as well. And it's got a bit of a bad reputation on campus for being an energy hog. So we're going to go through the scoring process and see whether it deserves that reputation or not. So how to get started? First of all, you're going to want to create an account in the lab benchmarking tool. That's pretty easy to do. You just click on the create account button and then log in with that account. Really important thing to do, and this is the biggest problem everyone has with using the LBT, is not clicking on the email that you'll get to confirm your email address. If you don't do that, you can't log in. So make sure you click on that email confirmation, and then you'll be able to log into the tool. Then next thing to do is to read the quick start guide that I mentioned before. It's linked here as well. What the quick start guide will tell you is the minimum information you need to enter on your building to benchmark your building and to get an energy score. So you want to go collect that minimum data. For this building here, I put it in a little table. So we've got the building's name, the year it was built, the fact that it's real. It's really fictional, but let's pretend that it's real for the purposes of this webinar. And the address, then organization type and predominant lab use type. We'll get into those in a second, but you're choosing those from a drop-down menu. It's not a free field to enter, so it's quite easy. The typical occupancy hours per week. The number of buildings, that's a required field, but that's normally 1 for buildings. Then there's some details on floor areas that we'll also talk a little bit about. That stuff's important. There's the number of ducted fume hoods in the facility. And then of course, there's your annual utility consumption data. And we're just collecting data on an annual basis right now. We're not looking for monthly data or anything more granular than annual. So armed with that data, we go to the Your Buildings tab, we click on New Building. And then we start entering our data. So there are 5 data entry tabs here. You don't have to enter data on all of those tabs to get the minimum data entry. So we'll step through each of them. The address here, so you can see I've put in the name of the building, the year built, all that other data that I showed you before. The address here is a Google address lookup. So you just start typing the address. There'll be a dropdown that will appear. You select one of the options from the dropdown. That'll be a real address that we're able to look up: latitude, longitude, climate zone, all the rest of it. You just choose one of those. It's very simple. And then for the organization type and lab use type, as I mentioned, those are dropdowns. So you just choose the best match to your facility. Here, the org type is academic higher ed because it's a university campus. The lab use type is teaching because most of the labs in this building are teaching labs, perhaps not all, but that's predominant in the building. It's important to make that judgment call and say, look, this is basically a teaching lab building. A really important point, and I think this message is on a number of slides in the rest of this presentation, is that we went to quite a lot of effort to develop help text, useful help text for all of these fields. And you can access the help text by mousing over, like hovering over the eye in a circle anywhere that appears. So please do that because there's usually quite a lot of useful information there. We've also got FAQs on the tool that you can search and find other useful information on how to enter the data. But your first port of call is certainly those eyes in circles. So moving on to the next tab here, we've moved from the building details to the lab area tab. This is where you enter the gross floor area of your building, the total lab area here, and then a breakdown of the lab area by lab type. So the total lab area, that's an important one. So what we mean by that is net lab space within the building. We do have, again, if you hover over the eye, there's a detailed description of what we mean by lab space and lab support space, what types of spaces are included, what are not included. Importantly, lab buildings, for our purposes, are not considered to be 100% lab area. It's not because it's a lab building that would have 100% lab area. It's really the net amount of space within the building that you would classify as lab space or lab support space. So in this case, this building is 50,000 square feet. It's 40% lab space by area. That's a pretty normal number. Something from 20 to 40 something percent would be what you would find in a lot of lab buildings. We then ask you to split that up by lab type. So here, 30,000 square feet, roughly biology, 20,000 chemistry. None of this needs to be to the square foot accuracy. It's okay if it's, somewhat of an approximation, but it should be, as good as you can make it. Next tab, on the building systems tab, there's only one mandatory field there, and it's the one that you can easily skip over if you can miss it if you're not looking for it. So you should definitely make sure to fill this one out, which is the number of ducted fume hoods in the building. Again, this can be approximate. In this case, it's 50. If the real number was 52, I would not be worried. 50 is fine. Then there's no required fields on the management tab. So we're not even going to show that one for the purposes of getting through this quickly and showing you the minimum data entry. And then we go straight to the utility usage tab, which is where you enter that your data year was 2023 here. It started in January, and you enter your annual electric and natural gas totals. You can enter other types of fuels as well. This building just use electricity and natural gas. Then you need to scroll down to the bottom of this page and click the submit button. If you've left any of the mandatory fields out, or if there are any other errors in the data entry, it will warn you and you will not be able to hit submit until you fix those. So especially if you forgot to enter the number of fume hoods, it will warn you about that. But then you enter submit and your building now appears on the Your Buildings tab, Big Biochemistry Teaching Building. There it is, data year 2023. Once again, you can hover over any of the eyes that appear for more information. But the main thing to note is that you've got your energy score. It's right there. It's 26 for this building. It's shown in the summary table, simple as that. 26 is not a great score. So it seems like this building probably did deserve its reputation as something of an energy hog on campus. Although you should probably reserve judgment on that until you see what your other buildings score as well, because maybe there are other buildings you could even prioritize ahead of that. So you should get scores for them as well. But generally speaking, it shows you that it deserved that reputation as a bit of a hog. It's not all bad news though, from Labs2Zero, because as Gordon mentioned, we're going to have this AIM report functionality where the AIM report for this building would show you lots of great ideas for measures that you could implement and other projects that you could embark upon to improve the performance of this building, improve its both energy and emissions performance. So that's going to come later. In the meantime, let's just talk briefly about why the building got a bad score. So it's not only that it's got a high energy use intensity, although it does have a pretty high energy use intensity, but it's also to do with what went into the baseline allowed or predicted EUI for that building. So Josh showed one of these as well, but for this particular building, there's a baseline allowance here that's the same for all the buildings, the occupied hours adjustment, the lab area adjustment. This one's in a warmer place than the one that Josh showed, so it gets a bigger allowance for cooling degree days. It's not manufacturing, so it gets nothing for that. It is teaching, and teaching actually gets you a deduct because typically teaching labs are less energy intensive than R&D labs, and that's based on a statistical analysis of our data set. So you are comparing to other teaching labs when you're using this score. You get the biochemistry adjustment, and then you come to this allowed EUI. In this particular case, the actual EUI, source EUI, is 23% higher than the allowed. And so you take that ratio of 1.23, you compare it to the ratios of all the other buildings, essentially in the lab benchmarking tool database, and you find that 74% of buildings have a better ratio than that. So this building's energy score is 100 minus 74, which is 26. And that's how it gets that bad score. So as I mentioned, you can take that bad score, compare it to the other scores of buildings on campus and decide which building to prioritize, which building to run an AIM report on, all that sort of stuff, once the AIM report's available. You can also do other things within the LBT today. You can click on the building details button. You can look at more details about performance over time of this building once you enter multiple years of data. You can look at other summary information, any warnings about your score. You can also go back to that manual benchmarking process and look at any more details you want to. You can select a slightly different peer group. In this case, I selected a reasonable peer group, similar types, similar lab areas, and this building ranked 17th out of 24 or so. Here it's like 17th lowest out of 24 for source EUI, which actually puts it right about that 26th percentile again. So we get the same answer as we did with the scoring procedure. So that should give you some confidence that it's working. You can do other things on the LBT as well. You can certainly do the operational practices benchmarking. You can use the current actionable insights module, which is a very simplified version of what the AIM report will ultimately be. You can connect your building to Portfolio Manager so that you can automatically import energy data from there. There's a lot of other things you can do that we just don't have time to get into today, but we've covered the main points here. And also, I hope demonstrated that it's actually pretty simple and quick to get an energy score for a building. So just to close, we're going to look ahead to some of the other things that are coming from Labs2Zero in the coming year. So in the energy score, as you know, we'll be releasing our Rev1 score later in the year. We would love for you to test out the energy score, give it a test drive, let us know what you think. give us data on Bavaria, cold weather facilities, more manufacturing facilities, please. We will be releasing an operational emissions score also this year. So Josh and his team are also working on that. Look out for that coming in probably just a few months. The embodied carbon score will be coming later this year as well. As Gordon mentioned, we are collecting data for that benchmarking exercise right now. So if you do have whole building LCA data, life cycle analysis data that you would be able to share, please do let us know. And then we will be releasing our first version of that AIM report that Gordon mentioned later this year as well. So lots of things happening. As Gordon mentioned, it's a really ambitious effort, an ambitious program, but we're excited for everything that's to come. I'm going to put up contact information for all of us right now. And I think we have about 10 minutes to answer some of the questions that people have put in the Q&A. So thanks everyone for listening, and I'll turn it back to Gordon for the Q&A.
Okay. So we pull up some of the questions, and I can sort of help direct them to everyone. So I guess the first question, looking at the Q&A, and then there's some in the chat too, but let me start with the Q&A. So one is, it says, I see there's some manufacturing sites as opposed to research labs. So are those, or what's in the data set, are those just manufacturing facilities, or are they really manufacturing laboratories? I think is really the question there. What does that really mean? Yeah.
Yeah, so I can take that one. So typically, yes, we do. You did see correctly. We have some manufacturing facilities in there. Those are typically pharma manufacturing sites. So there'll be, essentially lab buildings that have, clean room, GMP facilities, that sort of thing for manufacturing. We have maybe something around 100 of those in the data set right now. And we do account for manufacturing facilities in our scoring methodology, but we'd like to do better. So we are looking to gather more data on those facilities as part of our pilot phase.
Good. Next question comes down to, with the push to electrification going on, is there a way that the metrics can be separated? So I think he's saying here, like they're saying if the heating source for the facility changes during its life, do you create a new profile? How's that handled? So let's say maybe you did with gas and then you went to electrified, do you change the profile? How does that work?
Yeah, I can answer that one as well. So it's a good question. So the way that we have the data entry set up within the LBT, if your fuel mix or if other building properties change year to year, you just change those parameters in the next year of data. So you have one facility, and then you can have different fuel mixes for the different years of data within that facility. So it is very easy to reflect that type of change as a building changes over time.
And there was one question saying, as the buildings change, how does that affect the score? So I think that was one of the questions that came in.
I see that building there, the one about that question there. If other buildings get worse and yours stay the same, the score would go up. Okay, it's a really good question. So not right away. So the way we're going to handle this is probably pretty similar to the way that the EPA handles Energy Star scores as well, where we freeze the scoring system and those parameters based on our data analysis, and then we reanalyze it over time. So periodically over time. So for right now, if your building stays the same, your score will stay the same. But when we issue the Rev 1 score, maybe we'll have different scoring parameters. Your score might change then. And then in 5 years' time, if all of the other buildings improve and yours stays the same, then your score would get worse when we reanalyze that data. But it won't happen on a continual basis there. It would be just when we reanalyze the data set.
Okay, so another question on is the information kept secure? How do we do that in terms of security with respect to, I assume more in terms of anonymity, keeping the data anonymous?
Josh, do you want to talk about the data security in the building performance database?
Sure, yeah. So all data is anonymized as it's transferred over to the peer group data set. Only the characteristic information is left included. And so, yeah, there's no ability to identify a specific building based off of those peer group comparisons within the output visuals.
Good. Let me do try some quick ones from the chat. So one was, what do we mean by cold climate labs? You know, Toronto, Montreal, Whitehorse, you know, which are those all cold climate? What is that? You know, what does it mean?
Yeah, good question. So by cold climate here, the areas where the data set is lacking are sort of climate zones 6 and above, ASHRAE climate zone 6 and above. So Toronto, I think is 5, Montreal is 6, and Whitehorse is, I don't know what, but somewhere higher than that. So 6 and above is really where we'd like to collect more data.
And then can this be used to benchmark in the concept phase? So in terms of like InDesign, if people are looking to do some energy modeling, see where they stand, can this be done for design buildings, InDesign buildings?
Yeah, I can answer that. Yeah, absolutely. You can enter InDesign buildings into the lab benchmarking tool. You can see what score they would get. We would ask that you label them. It's a little drop down. You'd label it as being in design so that we know it's not an existing building. But yes, you can certainly compare. We will be rolling out some other features to make that a little bit easier. So we're going to be adding a target setting feature where you can kind of do a reverse score where you can say, what energy consumption do I need to get a certain energy score? And that'll work quite well for buildings that are in design. And we'll also be revamping the site a little bit to better accommodate buildings that are in design. And that'll be working into the embodied carbon side of things, which we've often got that data only for buildings that are in design, and also for that Design2Zero report that Gordon was mentioning, that ultimately we will be offering a design advice on new buildings as well. But today, yeah, absolutely, you can enter InDesign buildings into the tool.
So another question going back to the Q&A is that some buildings are mixed use. You know, do we choose the largest use when classifying a building? So if you got a 75% vivarium, 25% R&D, you know, what is that considered? How do you classify it?
Yeah, we would ask you to make a judgment call on that one and just choose the most predominant. For lab types within the building, as I showed on one of those slides, you do enter the breakdown of lab type within the building. So if you have, you know, 80% biology and 20% vivarium, that's information that you would provide. And then we would say, okay, that's mostly a biology building, but we would know that it's got some vivarium space in there as well. I did notice that there was a comment here just while we're on Vivaria about those not usually being metered separately. And I wanted to make it clear that we're not looking for separately metered vivarium spaces within biology facilities. We're looking for whole building data, always whole building data, just for buildings that have quite a lot of vivarium space within it. So, you know, by a vivarium dominated facility, you know, maybe that's at least 50% of the lab space within the building is vivarium space. We're looking for whole building data on those buildings.
Yeah, and even one that has 10 or 20% is still very valuable for us to see. So that, you know, definitely those are also useful for us for data input. And there's a question here on embodied carbon. What are we looking for there? So just I'll answer that. So in the embodied carbon, what we're hoping to get is, and we're going to be focusing on initially, is more what's called the A1 to A3, which is sort of the equipment, you know, not the as used, you know, or construction, but really the products themselves. And we're going to focus initially on the superstructure, sort of substructure, like the basement, the superstructure, and the envelope, sort of your concrete and steel. Eventually, we'll be adding more pieces to that, and we're definitely looking for input on the other pieces. But in terms of what will, you know, in terms of most important to create a score is going to be that superstructure, substructure, you know, envelope in that sort of A1 to A3, which is sort of the product side. So obviously looking for other data to add in is optional, but in terms of requirements, that's the key focus on embodied carbon. Again, we have the recording, so we will, again, is being recorded, so we'll be able to provide that for people. Going back to, we have another minute here just to finish up. So one is, so participants can get a score, but, you know, can they see the calculated site EUI and source EUI? So can they see the individual details of that? So maybe the question for Alison.
Yeah, and the answer is yes. You also have calculated site EUI and source EUI that are visible within the tool, as well as the score. And to highlight that the score, you know, goes beyond what you can do with a simple site EUI or source EUI building to building comparison, because it takes into account the fact that, you know, lab buildings are not a monolithic category, that, you know, it's unfair to compare a physics teaching lab on one side with a chemistry R&D lab on the other. So it really tries to level that playing field to give you a really good sense, a meaningful sense of which buildings are higher performers than others, but you do get all that information there as well.
All right, I think we've covered most of the questions, so I think it's time we'll finish up. It's 2:00. So again, we appreciate everyone's involvement and participation and your questions, and hopefully this is helpful. If obviously, feel free to get in touch with myself or Alison or Josh or Kathleen as well in terms of any questions or any input on the program. So thank you very much. We'll see you all, and thanks again for your interest and participation.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.